People say Japan is one of the most fascinating and misunderstood cultures in the world. We're not the loudest people either when we're misunderstood. What if I told you much of what happens in Japan isn't actually said, but silently understood? Imagine if you're walking into a room and everyone else seems to be aware of something, but you're not. In fact, if you don't read the room, you might be completely missing what's going on. Also, many famous Japanese authors, film directors, and artists like Yasunari Kawabata, Yasujiro Ozu, Haruki Murakami, and Ryuichi Sakamoto are known to utilize this concept and explore the impact of meaning between the lines and silence in their works. It's often said that it's one of the biggest characteristics when we try to understand Japanese art and culture. If you like Japanese books and films, this video might be an interesting one for you. If you prepare yourself to scrutinize these seemingly empty spaces and silence, you might actually discover a whole new meaning, and your experience with Japanese culture may become richer. In this video, we can explore Japan's unspoken culture together. You might see things differently after watching this video, you never know. Let's start. What is Japan's unspoken culture? I don't know if you heard about the concept of high context culture and low context culture. The concept of high-low context culture generally refers to our reliance on context in spoken and unspoken communication. This concept was first introduced by the anthropologist Edward T. Hall back in 1959. I read his book called Beyond Culture, and Japan is often cited as a prime example of a high-context culture, where much of the communication is indirect, relying heavily on shared understanding and context. He explains how Japanese society values harmony, subtlety, and implicit understanding. It goes completely the opposite way against countries that don't heavily rely on context, such as US, Germany, and other Western nations, where communication tends to be more explicit and perhaps direct. I think both have pros and cons, but understanding both communications would definitely widen the horizon. He briefly mentions the Japanese novelist and Nobel Prize winner Yasunari Kawabata in the book as an example of how Japanese culture expresses itself through subtlety and empty spaces between the lines. We can discuss this in more details later on in this video. I'll show you his high-low context culture diagram here. Personally, I don't quite agree with this fully, but this is the global mapping generally published online. I'll give you some simple examples of high context culture in Japan. People in Japan may give you indirect refusals. Maybe they say, that's difficult, meaning no. Difficult, 難しい, would actually mean just simply difficult. Hard but not impossible. But nuanced use would be hard but not impossible. But because of that, that's probably best to just mean not feasible. So no. The role of silence in communication, for example, in business meetings or job interviews, you're expected to read the room or read the air, they say, 空気を読む. Otherwise, you're labeled as KY, 空気読めない, meaning you're insensitive. And what happens when we put people with high context culture and those with low context culture together? Let's do a mental experiment together. Team low context, directness, explicit, verbal clarity. Team high context comes with much ambiguity, unspoken social cues, unexpressed expectations. I can put them in the same room, maybe some extreme individuals from both teams, just to make it better. The results may include leaving team low context with misunderstandings and much ambiguity, probably feeling quite unproductive even. On the other hand, team high context is not used to receiving such direct and explicit expressions, and this could result in some surprises and even some hurt feelings. They should get used to it. I have had share amount of experiences like this way back in the day, when I was a soft fluffy feather straight out of Japanese toy town. So where did this culture come from? What's the background? Well, there are three reasons here mainly. Either nation homogeneity. A shared history led to fewer explicit explanations. To explain this, landlocked or countries with shared borders probably had to explain with more clarity as people with different cultures were coming and going. Island nations had a more unified and shared culture in a country, leading them to fewer explicit explanations. I also think in history, land-connected countries probably had to fend off other cultures coming in and merging with their own. possibly causing them to be a bit more explicit about their own culture in order to establish and protect their identity. Island nations perhaps were allowed to have a bit more laid-back approach to this, as they were physically enclosed almost. Or in Japan's case, good or bad, they were controlling the amount of influence from outside themselves by physically restricting entry. I always think language is culture, and therefore our culture is shown in communications quite a lot. Confucian and Buddhist influence. Confucianism was introduced to Japan way back in time, around 6th century, and this laid the basics of many aspects of Japanese society, especially hierarchical relationships like joge kankei, traditional relationships like ruler to people, parent to child, husband to wife, older to younger, and keeping harmony with friends and peers. In Japanese workplace, junior person may not openly contradict with other senior people. It's coming from this. Then Buddhism emphasizes on silence, harmony, and indirect communication. This is actually a big influence on us. Even modern Japanese people might say they don't have a religion. Japanese people often downplay personal opinions to maintain unity, preserve the group harmony. Japanese people have this Buddhist concept in themselves without even knowing it. And this shapes Japan's high context culture and communications where silence actually holds meaning. And the more indirect speech allows them to avoid conflicts so that they can preserve the harmony with others. Without everyday Japanese people being aware of it, Buddhism actually played a big role in laying grounds for our daily disciplines, like cleanliness and order, mindfulness, simplicity, patience, respect for nature, and etiquette. Samurai and Edo-Era Etiquette. Honor-based society where subtlety meant survival. Bushido, samurai code, which is actually heavily influenced by Buddhism. It's related to this as well. Restraint and reading between the lines were an important part of Bushido. Samurai or Bushi existed in different names over a period of about 700 years in Japan. So it's probably not a surprise. How Japanese are trained to have silent communications. Apart from the things we discussed earlier and things we get taught from families, schools, and friends, there are a lot of things people in Japan consume growing up that help us nurture these skills. From nursery rhymes hinting some encouragement to read between the lines, starting early, to childhood manga comics acting as an assisted mind reading practice via thought bubbles. Many of us had weekly fresh comics to read growing up. We did look forward to our weekly mental reading practice very much. And literature and art. Japanese books have become increasingly popular in the world, which is great. So many of you may have noticed already. One of the most notable characteristics of Japanese literature can be this unspoken culture being present in the works. We're constantly asked to read between the lines. This is especially so in pure literature, what we call junbungaku. When it gets so complicated, of course our comprehension may not reach the core level, and that's okay. A good example is Kamakura by Soseki Natsume. It was purposely written in a way that readers would find something new every time you read it. A bit like experience of looking at the painting Ophelia, as mentioned in the book. It can be a story of an artist who goes to a hot spring village to seek inspiration and meets a woman. But it can be very complex if you want it to be. Yasunari Kawabata is very famous for this way of communication. Snow Country is a great example. He's known to tell stories between the lines. Earlier I mentioned about Beyond Culture by Edward T. Hall. In the book, he uses Kawabata's writing to illustrate the concept of high context communication, where much is conveyed through what's left unsaid, rather than through direct expression. It reflects the cultural emphasis on nuance and the importance of context in Japanese art and life. He often highlights how this approach contrasts with the more direct and explicit communication typical in low-context cultures. By referencing Kawabata's work, he shows how even in literature, Japanese culture values suggestion and silence, creating meaning through what's implied rather than overtly stated. Haruki Murakami explores more experiential spacing in reading experience, which helps it to be more expansive and personal, in my opinion. It kind of connects with Ryuichi Sakamoto, actually. Japan's legendary composer and musician, Ryuichi Sakamoto, has repeatedly talked about paying extra attention to creating spaces in his works. He was interested in the relationship between time and space and tried to challenge the concept in which music always follows the timeline, which is always one direction. I think this links back with the experience of reading Sosuke's Kamakura. Because in a story, the order of reading shouldn't really matter. Because we're reading like we're looking at a painting, I highly recommend having a go with Sosuke's Kamakura, also known as Grass Pillow, and be challenged. Apparently a new translation was published in recent years, so it should be good. Another one to note is, of course, Yasujiro Ozu, one of the greatest Japanese film directors of all time. He also made sure he utilized the spaces and constantly invited us to explore the meaning between the lines. As a result, experience is so expansive, it adds so much more depth if you try to look into those spaces. Of course, it's not that it can only be done by the Japanese directors. A famous German film director, Wim Wenders, made a film called Perfect Days with Japanese cast. Many of you probably have seen it already. The film utilized the Japanese high context culture communication, and I love the fact that it was Wim Wenders who did it. He loves Yasujiro Ozu, and we can totally see where some of the ingredients are inspired from. Based on Hall's context culture chart, Germany and Japan are on the opposite ends of the spectrum. But Perfect Days was a beautiful film, and we should take a moment to see what hidden stories were told throughout the film, other than what we actually saw. I love how people in the world are enjoying these Japanese works. Growing up in the countryside of Japan with pretty much no contact with outside of the country, I never imagined people would be interested. We can agree or disagree, of course, but sometimes I look up online reviews to see how the world thinks of some of the things I read or watched. I couldn't find many reviews written in English before, but now it's brilliant. I can read what people are thinking. Often I do come across comments like, it was monotonous, quiet, and perhaps even not much is happening. And that's of course absolutely fine. It is though often related to this concept of hidden cultures, and sometimes I think if we pay a little more attention, and they may be able to enjoy more and see something new. So that's my aim of this video. Final thought, Japan's invisible culture is everywhere. But if we pay special attention, we will have a richer experience. Japan is rapidly changing, and more crossover of cultures is definitely happening. With the current tourism trends, I think Japan has shifted in people's mind from bucket list country to something like I'm going there next week country. And more people have a deep understanding in Japanese art and culture, which is amazing. But if you're looking to have a better understanding, then I definitely recommend having this concept of hidden communication in mind when you consume Japanese books, films, and real-life experiences. Let me know in the comments your experiences with Japan's hidden culture, things you've seen in viral videos you want to know if it's true. Like, subscribe, and hit the bell to support my brand new channel. And you'll uncover more about mid-brow Japanese culture. See you in the next video.